In this video, we're going to be looking at how homes play an important role in ministry in the New Testament, throughout the New Testament, both in the Gospels and in Acts, and we see it also in Paul's epistles. References to households, or the Greek word is oikos, and it means everybody that was a part of that home and the community of that home. The structure of the home, all in sort of an economic unit. And this is really important. I think, for those of us from the established church, we have a tendency to think, oh, well, the church met in homes because it couldn't afford a nice building like the one we have, here in America or somewhere else. But that's not true at all. There's something there. There's a dynamic. There's an advantage of this kind of place for doing ministry. So we're going to begin by looking at oikos, or household, remember, household, in the ministry of Jesus. Now, the common perception is that Jesus is, during his ministry at least, is a homeless man. He's an itinerant preacher. He goes around and he's not making a living. So, some people sort of think of him as almost a beggar. We sometimes think of him as a man who just lay down to sleep wherever he was, whenever, it got too dark to keep going or whatever. And admittedly, some of this interpretation is from Jesus' own words, "The Son of Man has no place to lay his head." Obviously, he did not own a home during that time, and he wasn't, especially in regard to Nazareth, he wasn't back home where he had come from. However, I think we're going to see as we go through some of these scriptures that if we read these gospel accounts, there's a clear pattern that Jesus was sustained by households, and he was actually a member of a household, and from that household he ministered to surrounding areas. So, I think in contrast to what we commonly think, and what I thought for many, many years, that Jesus is just, going in all different directions and doesn't even know where he's going to be that night. We're going to see that a household plays a really significant part in his ministry and in his life. And I think that leads into a pattern that we're going to see in the apostles later on. So, did Jesus have an oikos? Well, it doesn't appear that he was very close to, Mary and his brothers back in Nazareth. So, in that sense, perhaps not. But there's a surprising number of references that just sort of blow my common assumptions away, and they're from the Gospel of Mark. Now, let's just remember, Mark is written most likely based on the recollections of Peter, the apostle. So here we find in Mark all kinds of references to Peter's family and his home that aren't in the other Gospels. And that's not surprising when we consider, this is probably because Peter's largely telling this story. So Jesus is with Peter and Andrew and James and John there in Mark 1. He's been performing miracles, and they go to Peter and Andrew's home. And when they get in the home, the people there tell Jesus that Peter's mother-in-law is ill, and it appears to have been something very, very serious. So Jesus goes in and he heals her. And immediately she gets up and starts serving Jesus and the other followers that were there. I would say that a great way to get invited into a home or get in good with a family is you go heal the mother-in-law. Yeah, the wife is all worried about her mom and maybe tied down taking care of her and not getting much help. And then you walk in and heal that mother-in-law. My guess is it's likely in most villages around the world, you're going to have an open door for a meal or a place to put your head down anytime you're close by. And that's exactly what we see in Mark 1. And then after Jesus has come there and stayed in the home, the next morning he gets up early and goes out to pray alone like we know he often does. And when he comes back, the disciples find him, whatever, they say, Lord, everybody's looking for you, because, they want some help with somebody else who's sick or for some other reason. But the fact is, the whole village knows that Jesus is staying with Peter, and they're looking for him at Peter's house. From the very beginning, now Jesus is identified with this home. So Jesus is out doing ministry, and they come back to Capernaum, and word spread through the village in just a very short time, as it would in almost any village around. Word gets around quickly. They heard that he was at home, and that's actually what Mark says. Jesus is home now. Well, where is he? He's at Peter's house. But something rather significant has happened. This appears now to be the Lord's home. He's at home, and the whole community saw him as a part of this home. Now, if you're a stranger coming through any village in the world, people might invite you in, but they're a little skeptical because they don't know you. But once you're connected to any home in a small village, everybody knows who you are. You have an instant doorway into the whole community. And that appears to have happened by Mark 2 very quickly. So we see in Mark 3, next chapter, again, Jesus is out doing ministry. He's actually staying at Peter's home part of the time and then going out and doing ministry in the surrounding area. And but now again, he came home, and very quickly again, word is out. Jesus, the teacher, the miracle worker, is here. We all know where he is. Let's go over to Peter's house and find him. And a large crowd had gathered in that place. So now, again, we're seeing in these right off the bat in Mark, chapter 1, 2, and 3, Peter is telling us that Jesus had a home at his house. I think that's going to become sort of significant as we look at this ministry. And then later he's out with the disciples and he's teaching, and he spends some time with them privately trying to explain things in more detail, and then he's out telling stories and parables into the whole crowds. And what we see here in the 9th chapter is that sometimes when they come back to Peter's house or Jesus's house, this is where the disciples ask him those hard questions. Maybe they were too embarrassed to ask out there in front of the crowds, or there's just so many people. It's not a good place. But now they're coming back to the house, and Jesus is teaching the disciples more deeply because it's a more private place. So, oh my goodness, right here in Mark, we're seeing all these different ways that this home is becoming integrated into the whole ministry of Jesus. He's staying there. People bring the sick. They come to ask him questions. He's going out from that home into the surrounding area. And let's just say that they walk 20 miles or whatever. They could cover hundreds probably of villages in that circle around Capernaum. And then he's coming back there, and people again hear about it, and they're immediately coming. And then it is sometimes in this home where the disciples get to ask him those questions about something he said, and they're probably thinking, we should know what he's talking about, but they have no idea. Let's ask him in private. This becomes maybe critical to their growing understanding of who Jesus is. So all of this is taking place in Capernaum, which is on the Sea of Galilee. And it is a mid-sized town. Now, Nazareth is so small, it doesn't even show up on any maps of that time period. And rarely is it ever mentioned anywhere except in the New Testament. So this is a place, it's a mid-sized town. It's certainly bigger than Nazareth. It's on the crossroads. But it's also far from the primary control centers. It's not like there's a big Roman garrison there. It's not, like Jerusalem or Caesarea or one of those places where Jesus might be watched constantly. So from Capernaum, he had easy access by road and the lake itself. And we know how many times they get in a boat and go across the lake because they can get over there so fast, far faster than walking. So they have access to many people from Capernaum. And maybe one of the reasons this becomes his ministry center is that there was an oikos that took him in. And he felt at home. And it was such a practical thing in terms of staying healthy, getting some sleep, getting something to eat, all those kinds of practical things. So we see from this example then that Jesus used at least one oikos for material and social support. And I would say there are evidences that there were maybe several others of these oikoses where he had very close, almost family-like relationships. Lazarus' home, for instance, may have been something like that as well. So it's not like Jesus is just wandering around and drops down under any tree. Now, there may have been times when he and the disciples had to do that. There were no, hotel chains along any of the roads they were on, like there are for most of our roads. So we see that an oikos was helpful to Jesus. Peter's home, specifically in Capernaum, was a primary site of ministry, beginning with Peter's own family, but extending to the neighbors there, and probably over time to a growing number of villages in that whole area. They knew that Jesus not only went to Capernaum, but they went to Peter's house. So this home became a base of outreach to neighboring villages. We see that in the storyline repeatedly. They go out from there, and maybe a few days later they come back to there. And there were many villages within walking distance, or hop in the boats and go across the lake from this particular location. So it looks like a strategic place to do the kind of ministry that he wanted to do. Now, Christ's participation in this home, relationship with Peter's family and the mother-in-law, and probably Peter's wife, because he'd done this to her mother, helped establish a later pattern of kingdom communities. And I believe it may play into even how Jesus sent the disciples out on mission in the Gospels. So Jesus clearly depended on a group of patrons and matrons for material and social support. There are many references to this actually in the Gospels. And some of those might have been, again, like this house. While you're in that area, you stay at that house. And these people, quite often the women, who are always taking care of all the practical stuff, right? And so that's happening in the ministry of Jesus. Now, a typical house in Palestine at that time, it's actually amazing from archaeology and all, how much we know about typical houses in Palestine in the first century. It probably on average had a small living room inside the house, and then it had an enclosed courtyard. And there's probably a gate outside, out on the edge of that courtyard. And we know, even in Jerusalem, that some of them have a large space above the living area, so that, in the evenings or early mornings, you could go up there and maybe catch a little bit of the breeze before the heat of the day. So even though the houses were not probably on average as large as the ones we're used to, there's actually a lot of space, especially when you consider on top of the house or in the courtyard. And the really interesting thing is that archaeologists pretty much know where Peter's house was in Capernaum, which is rather, isn't that amazing? I'm just blown away by that kind of thing. And by studying very carefully all the bedrock, of that site of Peter's house there, they know several things about that particular house. It was first a house church. And that means that the basic house as it had been laid out and lived in without a whole lot of change was turned into a place to meet. Maybe people are still living there. Likely they are. And that seems to be the pattern of house churches all over the empire, Roman Empire, during that first century. Christians would start meeting just in the house as it was. If they couldn't all get inside and they needed to get inside, like maybe it was raining and the speaker's inside, then they stood out in the courtyard. Or, probably more likely, on most days, the teacher or pastor or whoever is out in the courtyard, and much of this activity is taking place out there, perhaps while the women are fixing a meal inside the house. Well, then it was changed, and they took that basic house and they expanded it, take out a wall here, extend the roof a little bit here. You can still see where the original home was, but now you can see that it has been enlarged and changed. It's now what some people call a church house. It started out as a house, but it's been enlarged and adapted now. So it's not just like it was as a house, it's bigger, and that becomes a church house. And then at some time later, maybe a whole generation later, the people who've been worshiping there now for some time say, this is not enough room. And so on that property, they actually build a special church building with perhaps more room or maybe nicer setup for worship or whatever. And all of that can be traced on this site that Jesus considered home, according to Mark, during his ministry in and around the city of Capernaum. As believers continued meeting and worshiping there for several decades after the ministry of Jesus. So then let's get to the apostles, because, again, we sort of think of them largely as traveling all the time. Like with Paul, we refer to his journeys, even though several of those journeys, the majority of the time was spent in one city, like Corinth or Ephesus. But we still think of them as journeying a lot. And of course, they were walking, so it took a while to get from one place to the next. But when Jesus trains them and sends them out in Luke 10 and gives them verses 1 to 16, their instructions about how to go out on mission together, here's some basic things he told them. He said, first of all, I'm sending you out in pairs. They're always going to have somebody else with them, which is both for safety probably and mutual encouragement. He directed them to go specifically to villages where he was later going to come. So they're probably maybe on the same road or maybe a couple of roads, but Jesus knows he's going there. And so he tells them, don't just go anywhere. I want you to go in preparation for me coming to that place. And probably unlike what we're thinking when we go out and do that, I don't know if you've done that kind of thing before. I have. That our tendency to think we're looking for converts. We're looking for people who are open. Well, Jesus jumps beyond that and actually talks about looking for people who are going to work with you. You're looking for co-workers. You're looking for a sponsor in that village, for instance, and someone who can speak for your message, even though in the early stage they may not even be a follower, believer yet. So these are some of the common threads we see and the directions that Jesus gave for this travel. And I know that Jesus is not giving us directions that we have to follow, but I'm just telling you, there's so many places in the world where this still works better than anything I think you're ever going to find. In places where people, and much of the world is very hospitable, in contrast to most of us Americans, you know. They are. They're just very friendly and they're hospitable. They want to find out. They're curious. They want to ask you questions. And even though they're poor, and sometimes it appears that the less that you have, the more likely you are to share what you have. And I think that's especially true in America. The people who have the most quite often aren't really sharing much of it. So Jesus gives them some instructions while they're out on the road. He said, don't stop, and I don't want you like preaching out on the highway. You know, that's not a good place. I want you to get to the village. I want you to get into a house, because that's where the most significant ministry is going to take place. And he says, you're looking for somebody who will just simply take you in. Now, again, that if you've never done this in other places, this seems rather strange. I know in my neighborhood here in California, I think people would starve to death before anybody took them in. And that's not a criticism of California. I think that'd be true just about anywhere in America. We don't function that way. But back in the day where they were taught to be hospitable, hospitality was important in the first century church, and it's important in the values of the community at large. So you go to that village and you start looking around and you try to meet people and see if somebody won't take you in. And then if they take you in, you stay in that house. You don't, let's say that you get invited into a fairly poor house, and after you get invited there, you start hanging around and you see some other nicer houses, and maybe the lady next door is a better cook. Jesus says, don't go anywhere else. You stay there. They invited you. And so you stay there and you eat what they put in front of you. He says that actually twice.